Thank you for the enthusiasm. Just channel it towards your seats as we proceed with our lineup. Thank you again for being here at the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. It's a real pleasure for you to join us on this, sadly, our final day. And a special thank you as well to everyone joining us on the live stream, both at home in Trinidad and wherever you are around the world. We're so pleased that you're with us. We don't often do cross-genre sessions at the festival, but when we do, you can be certain they're bound to be explosive. And that will be the case with this panel. We're having Canisia Lubrin and Nicole Sealey in conversation with Michael A. Bucknor. Please give them a round of applause. I read an excerpt of the Ferguson Report and Erasure in the depth of COVID, when many of us were going through many things. And it was healing to me, even in its absolute terror. It's such a delight to have Nicole with us here this year, who is, as you know, this year's 2024 OCM Bocas Prize Poetry winner. I have also always found the work of Canisia Lubrin, from the very first line of the very first poem, visionary and life-saving. And with Code Noir, a foray into an experimental hybrid form, I think you will also find yourselves deeply met. Please enjoy the conversation.
Thanks to Bocas for this invitation to join with these two brilliant writers. I'm Michael A. Bucknor. I'm insisting on the A because there are two criminals by the name of Michael Bucknor. So if you see A being inserted here, there, and everywhere, it's to make a distinction. I'm formerly of the University of West Indies Mona campus, where I spent 23 years of my career, and currently at the University of Alberta. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you today, people you might know, two beautiful souls, but also two distinctive voices who received early career acknowledgement and who have now established themselves as significant Caribbean diasporic voices on the literary landscape. What a joy it will be to speak with them today. Nicole Sealey was born in St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands, and raised in Florida. She's the author of the Ferguson Report and Erasure, winner, as you have heard, of the 2024 OCM Bocas Prize for Poetry, and an excerpt from which was awarded the Forward Prize for the Best Single Poem. She's also the author of Ordinary Beast, a finalist for the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and the book, The Animal After Whom Other Animals Are Named, beautiful titles, winner of the Drinking Gourd Chapbook Poetry Prize. Her honors also include a 2024 to 2026 Princeton Arts Fellowship, a Coleman Center Fellowship from the New York Public Library, a Rome Prize in Literature from the American Academy in Rome, a Hodder Fellowship from Princeton University, the Stanley Kunitz Memorial Prize from the American Poetry Review, and the Poetry International Prize, and fellowships from Canto Mundo, Cave Canem, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the New York Foundation for the Arts. She teaches in the MFA Writers Workshop in the Paris program at New York University. Please welcome her with a round of applause. And Canisia Lubrin, born in St. Lucia, now lives in Ontario, Canada. Her books include the poetry collections Voodoo Hypothesis, The Disgraphist. Lubrin's work has been recognized with the Griffin Poetry Prize, the OCM Bocas Prize for Caribbean Literature, overall prize, and also the OCM Bocas Prize for Poetry, the Derek Walcott Prize, the Writers' Trust of Canada Rising Stars Prize, and many others. Also a finalist for the Trillium Award for Poetry and the Governor General's Literary Award. Lubrin has held fellowships at the Banff Center in Alberta, Canada, Civitelli Ranieri in Italy, Literature Colloquium Berlin, Simon Fraser University, Queen's University, and Victoria College at the University of Toronto. She studied at York University and the University of Guelph, where she now coordinates the creative writing MFA in the School of English and Theatre Studies. In 2021, Lubrin received the prestigious Wyndham Campbell Prize for Poetry, and the Globe and Mail named her Poet of the Year. Code Noir, Metamorphoses is her debut fiction and includes stories listed for the Journey Prize 2019, 2020, and Toronto Book Award 2018, and the Shirley Jackson Award. We are in literary stardom with these two. Welcome them. I'm going to invite both of them to read at the beginning, but just before they present their selected readings, I would ask them to respond to this question. Both works, one in poetry and the other in prose, engage their own, this is a phrase that has been going around, quarrel with history, by taking us to historical archival documents. So could you first say something about how the central historical document works in your creative project, and then read from your book? I'll begin with Nicole.
Thank you for the generous introduction, and I'm just so honored and grateful to be here. Thank you for the introduction. It's an honor, great privilege to be here. Quarrel with history, yeah? So I recently reread this piece by the poet Somaj Sharif on the politics of erasure. And in it, she notes that erasure is the closest poetry form to the role of the state, as the state insists on erasing us, yeah? And so I've been thinking about this recently, but while I was erasing the Ferguson Report, I don't think I was thinking of much. I think like everyone else, I was very taken with the fact that another Black body could be gunned down in the street. And so when I was erasing the report, I had no idea that I was erasing it towards this project, right? I think it was an impulse to try to perhaps undo something. With that, I'll begin reading. Horses, hundreds, neighing. Part reflex, part reason, part particular urge. At gunpoint among them you are. Less likely to live into the wild go the captive born. Home in the high grass, a barking dog chokes itself against the pull of a tight leash, its neck extending farther than cries for help. A kind of headlight echoing, increasing in reach. The forecast red, the city red, diminishing to the proportion of whoever said death comes in threes is an optimist. Then the birds began to fly, low and patternless, as if they were each two hands joined, just pretending at birds. The soft music from passing cars shouting down the soft music of their dying. Stop, hands where I can see. A boy pretends to pray. His mark makes of her hands a bird and flies away. Stop, or I'll shoot, he kids. Then makes of his hands a gun, fires away. In the bushes, next to the lot across the street, a rustling like back talk, a deer. The animal out of nowhere flees, seconds too late. A design oversight assigned to that particular beast. On the police radio, a song, a threat, a slip of tongue in an ear, moist as an eye. Approached, the deer stiffens, a telltale sign the conditions under which it ran were breaking the skin. Worse, training the mind. Who among us is stunned by how fast rain pours from the sky? Stunned by how the sky, clear at first, self-corrects, as if to say, I mean this, not that, not this. With the living, I am familiar. A woman stretches the truth to disappear it, throws her voice to animate it, as when I imagine the word was made flesh. I've been trying to scrape up what I remember. 1,100 stems long, headless. 2, a few bad apples. 3, reports of a stolen pickup. You put down one color, Bearden thought, and it calls for an answer. What's an answer to black, I wonder? As for men lying face down in the street, knees on their necks, their hands behind their backs, laboring like babies on their bellies trying to crawl, then stiff as a dime down after a toss in the air, tails see heads, heads execution on the basis of fact, including the fact if true, with the caption, pass out, motherfucker. An idea came to me this morning like an honest mistake. It's sundown here. The day, almost entirely extinguished, closes its casket's crown after bearing gifts as pointed as its teeth. And I'll end with this final movement. They say, stand in line, so we stand in line. As the line advances, they say, stand still. Around us, everything going like cars or clouds. Us, the blur cars pass. The blue clouds dam. They say wait, so we wait. As if for some fragrant flower that unfurls one night a year. They say shh. So like trees we mouth cross sounds of flags beaten to shreds by wind. Our heads twitch, birds watching for what might be stalking. Right before they deploy canines to bite, there's a pause between wails in which you hear your shut eyes dilate. Listen.
So you seem to suggest that the erasure as form is a kind of counter-erasure to the erasure in life that black subjects experience. And I know you have a different text, different historical text, Canisia, Code Noir, and I want you to tell us a little bit about that and how it works in your creative project.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Bocas. I love you. Thank you, Nicole, and all of you for being here. How does the Code Noir work in this book, Code Noir? In terms of a quarrel with history, the Code Noir is a 1685 decree by King Louis XIV, which contained 59 articles, legal articles, that set the conditions of life for enslaved Africans in the French colonial empire. And for some reason, they had this set of disclaimers that applied to quote unquote freedmen. A book that I can write in this period of the early 21st century could only quarrel with such a history. It can't do anything else, right? But I recall Karen Lord's assertion about the prophet and how that orientation is not just about somehow predicting the future, but speaking the truth, whether it's in the present, in the future, in the past. But this book, in a sense, does disturb temporality because there is this ridiculous assumption that the past is only past. And what I take up in this book is a kind of quarrel, yes, with the ways that these administrative materials of colonial domination and their everydayness, their banality. It's just a day at the office for these people who were then deputized against black living, against black life in all of these ways. Certainly there's a quarrel there, but I think what I'm more interested in are the materials of black life that, as Christina Sharp has said, are in excess of those violences. And so there is a back turned in the quarrel, right? I know how dangerous you are, Code Noir, and all of your deputies. But what we have is a lot more powerful, and it is what allows us to persist and to survive and to do something that we can even call thrive. Yeah, so that's the work. And I will read an excerpt of one of the stories. So each story in here, there's 59 stories. And each one of them each one of them exists in relation to one of the articles of that king's codes. So this is Article 9, and it is put in relation to a story called Hula Hoop Prophet. I don't know how many of you will remember in the early 90s when the World Trade Organization dismantled its trade agreement with the agriculture producers of the Caribbean and left a great disaster in the wake of that, and went over the Chiquita and Dolan, etc. So that's what the background of the story is. This sort of set in that time. Article 9. Free men who will have had one or more children from their cohabitation with slaves, together the masters who will have suffered them, will each be condemned to a fine of 2,000 pounds of sugar, and, if they are the masters of the slave from whom they will have had the said children, want, in addition to the fine, that they be deprived of the slave and the children, and that she and them be awarded to the hospital without ever being able to be freed. Hula Hoop Prophet. As he did his prayers, the man believed the sky. The signs were born in the evening, signs that the drought would end sooner than the weather woman had said. Wind and drizzle threw stiff leaves and dust as far as could be seen. Low, howling nebulas rustled during the night. Nearer to dawn, steam left the crusted ground. Envoys leaving small serpentine cracks, vanishing up the ribbed stems of coconut trees. The drought ended. Dawn broke the new day. At sunrise, Charles eulogized the plastic tarpaulin he had taken from his father's tool shed. He had placed it over the rusting galvanized roof of the house 3 days ago when he was sure he could sense the rain. Then it came, heavier and heavier until it filled the white enamel peapot in the corner of the room. That tarp hadn't been large enough to cover the whole 12-foot wide triangular roof, and the man became a bad dream trapped beneath a rusting ceiling. But exhausted by the drought as he was, the rain had convinced him that desire was possible again, that a feast, some loving, a song, his children eating ice cream, could remind him of all that he was. Charles blinked. In the small alarm clock on the top of the laundry basket near the window had clicked on. Almost 5:30. In the still waking day, he reached toward the corner behind his head and uncovered jeans worn yesterday and the day before, a blue cotton t-shirt, holey black socks, and his faded black cap. 3 steps to the kitchen. Into jean pockets, his long fingers went like desperate fishing lines, fingernails as dark as rotting bait. A man whose grade 5 education once allowed him to practice an art as precise as farming now lured the survival of his family to lukewarm luck. He hoped to salvage an accountant's story from his pockets. From his right palm, 7 coins rolled and stopped on the kitchen table. From his left hand, he let fall 1 black button and 2 tamarind seeds. He said, "If you listening this morning, I hope some more today." Amid the clattering of coins, the pairing of seeds and button, and the veins of rain darting down the sides of the roof, Charles heard Zara's footsteps from behind the bedroom wall. She walked into the kitchen, pinching sleep from the corners of her eyes, the morning habit of thick thumbs and fingers. "I have to take the boy to the doctor today, Charles." Charles kept his face dreamy, careful. The woman picked the coins off the table and looked at them with open palm, as if they were nothing but stones, small, lifeless pebbles. But she could say little to Charles, who knew the accountant's story better than she did. 5.50. "I bet people will drink plenty coconut water at the market today," he said. "I have to take Clyde to the doctor for his 2-month checkup." "I heard you the first time, Zara." "And what? If you have to get medicine, wait." "Okay." Zara folded her arms to hoist her braless breasts, forced her feet into a pair of small rubber slippers outside. The rain needled her warm skin. She used the baby's bath basin to cover her head, shielding herself from the possibility of catching a cold, just like her parents had taught her. Quickly, she placed buckets and pails beneath waterspouts around the house, swapping full ones for their empty vessels. Once she was back in the kitchen, back inside the house, she prepared cornmeal porridge on a 2-burner kerosene stovetop. She did not trust that the drought had broken for good, and her priorities were first, catching water, breakfast for her family second, whatever else would keep her from drifting off into the seething rage of her thoughts about what living on an island meant in the same year that water was discovered on the planet Mars next. I'll stop there.
Thank you both. The poetry is very stripped down, very spare. The book of stories provides more space, but I'm very, very caught up with the ways in which the ordinary, the everyday, these stories of the everyday somehow represent how that state authority seeps down into individual lives. And so I'm kind of interested in your method, your creative method. Centrally, erasure is part of your work as well, Canisia, as well as Nicole's. And whether the creative method involves a kind of refusal in terms of kind of indigenous feminist conception of refusal that exposes the politics and philosophy behind these documents as articles of state. And secondly, of reimagination, that erasure process seems to engage, or perhaps more, but I'm kind of caught up with the idea of refusal and reimagination. Could you tell us more about your creative method in this work? You know, the kinds of choices that you make. Here's the document, which, you know, what aspects of it will I lift out and what will I erase, you know? What was that method like, and what informs that creative method?
Well, again, when I was reading and rereading the document and I began erasing it, I had no idea that this book would be a thing. You know, it was just an impulse that I was following. As I read and reread the document, I got to the conclusions reached at the back of towards the end of the report, and the conclusions were such that I could have come up with these conclusions, right? One of which was police need not be racist and need to be retrained. I could have told you that. You know, I didn't need to do research to tell you that. So in thinking back now on the process, how did words lift up and others fall back? You know, I don't know. I can't tell you. I can't tell you why some words rose to the surface. I can tell you that the process was painstakingly difficult, and I was not satisfied throughout the process, so I kept redoing and reimagining and erasing and highlighting and redacting, and there's nothing, and we were talking about this the other day, you have once I had an idea that this was a thing, I wanted it to be obviously the best thing it could be, right? Yeah. But what we produce could never live up to the idea of the thing we have in our minds. And so I had to be really generous with myself, yes, right? And understand that I can do what I can do. Also, time had to happen, and I love that you mentioned time earlier, and I was rereading your work as well as some interviews you did, and you mentioned in Code Noir that you had to move from the future to the past to the present, and I love this idea of time travel. And I had to do much of that in this book because, as you heard, I alluded to George Floyd, and George Floyd was 6 years after the death of Michael Brown, right? And so I had to do this bit of time travel to get at a kind of truth, and not like a fact-based truth, as I'm not trying to reach after fact. I want to be in a kind of confusion, you know, that negative capability Keats mentions. So time needed to happen. And so I had to let time happen and not rush the process. Yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I mean, part of that recovery of documents of the past, when we read it in terms of your own reimagining, we wondered if the past has ever passed. No. You know, it still remains with us. Yeah. We still see and encounter these things, and part of it is this weight, the duration of it, and you know, in the wake. As Christina Sharp suggests. I mean,
as you're sitting with yourself in the present writing the work, you can't help but bring those past selves with you, right? And those the fears that you have for the future, right? So all these things are the past, present, future. They're all in that present moment when we try to draft something as emotionally truthful as possible.
Yeah. Canisia, what do you think? Is there any kind of refusal in that process? Is there any kind of reimagining in that process? What are the other kinds of things that your creative method is achieving?
It's a good question. I think there are concentric refusals. You know, there are the refusals that happen as a kind of discovery as you're in the process of quote unquote creating writing, and I'm usually really hopeful that those happen early on, but they don't always happen early on. You know, I remember when I was drafting the final batch of stories that I wrote by our quote unquote belonging to nation, where you have a passport and an NIS number and all of these brandings and these markings that say where you can go and how, and whether you need a visa and this, that, and the other thing, to these structures down to the very, everyday occurrences that structure our most intimate exchanges and relations. And the ways that these things are invisible, they're invisibilized by a world that says to you, oh, but look how far you've come. Oh, you're not in handcuffs and chains anymore, as though those were the only grammars of domination and subjugation, you know? And so the refusal, I think, is this pretense that somehow progress has happened, quote unquote, progress has happened with such resolve and absoluteness that if you were to raise a single note against injustice now, you're labeled somebody who is just in love with making trouble, you know, and what do you have to complain about? Right, and so the materials of the characters' lives in the book stand in contrast merely to the logic of the codes themselves, because the logic of the codes themselves and their mere existence is already narrative. Yeah, the stories are already in them. Yeah. So I did not wish to reproduce the logic of those codes at all. So they kind of stand as the materials of themselves, as their own evidence in the book, and then to have the stories then enact another way of being in the world. Even as Christina was saying earlier, the violence is there. It's the weather, it's the climate, it's the architecture of a certain disarticulation of our imagination, right? And so what is to be reimagined at this point in our historical moment, in relation to a lot of the things that we find ourselves having to stake risks of our entire lives around. Yes. Right? You cannot say, for instance, you should not be committing genocide because somehow historically you yourself were a victim, or your ancestors were a victim of the same thing. Somehow simply articulating that.
Yeah, who controls the discourse of genocide?
The narrative of progress that has somehow supplanted the truth of a lack of progress is what I'm refusing.
Yeah. What I also found interesting in your book is that the images are also working in interesting ways. The images on which the codes are written, to which your stories are in conversation with, are marked in all kinds of different ways, as if an invitation to an active audience response, as if when these codes come to you, we cannot sit with them like that. Something must be done. They're always marked up. They're X's, they're crossed out, they're put in boxes, they're circled, and then the rest of the page, and so I was very fascinated in both books, in the sense of the book design. This idea that you go to a book and you're just reading words does not operate in both books. There's a particular way in which the page appears. And I think it's an invitation of an audience or a reader to, or somebody who, not just a reader, because you have these visual images, people who are interpreting this. And could you say a little bit more about the design of these texts, how the page appears, what is it inviting us to do? They're running away from the question.
Hello.
Quite fascinating for me.
Again, I didn't have the language with which to talk about this work until I had to talk about this work. And so in thinking about the work and there was a question the other day about what you bring with you to the page, what you bring with you to the creative process. And Christina mentioned books and music and art. And I'm sure that we all do the same. And thinking back on the process, I would say the work is in conversation with some pointillist arts, right? And some impasto arts. And pointillism, for those who don't know, is when an artist makes small dots of paint on a large canvas, and then it creates a larger image, a larger landscape. And so I would say that the work for me, if you're right up on it, you can't really, you see something, but you have to really step back. And I think, when I think now of the process, I think I was really thinking about pointillism and also impasto, when the painter uses very thick strokes, right? So you can actually see the paint from the brush or from the paint knife on the canvas. And so I really wanted it to feel textured in those ways, right? And I wanted to present various vantage points of various ways of seeing the erasure, which is why also I provided the lineated poems in the book's back. So yeah, I think this work is in conversation and with art,
Yeah.
with art.
Yeah. I kept wondering, did you have an artist that you were engaging with? Did you give somebody an idea of what you wanted? Did you do what? No, I'm Canisia. This is for you because you have images, throughout the entire project.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those images are all the work of Torquace Dyson, brilliant visual artist, really profound thinker. Torquace Dyson, no problem. She's a completely impressive human being. The dexterity of her talent and her thinking, I find, really clarifies so much. And when she talks about Black compositional thought and the ways that abstraction as a subject, not necessarily as a mode, can help us answer some questions, about space and how life happens in space and in the strictures that we can imagine expansively out of. So that's all her work. I can take no credit at all for that. But the motivation was precisely what I was saying earlier about not wanting to reproduce the logic of the codes. I didn't actually even want the codes to be legible in the book. Right. I wanted their presence to be disturbed.
Yes.
Right? They could not simply sit there in any passive white space. And so Torquace, it was as though we had a lyrical shorthand for this understanding. I really didn't have to explain much of anything. I just said, this is what's happening in the proofs right now, and I showed her my publisher's proofs. And she said, I ain't read the book, but I know that's not what you want. And so she said, send it to me. And she's the busiest person on the planet. But within a few weeks, she sent me back some extraordinary interventions that doubled the meaning of the stories, I think, that offered a kind of visual and haptic emotional space where the eye can pass and the reader can enter and even make their own metamorphoses out of these encounters.
It's extraordinary because the publishing world is not always controlled by people who have had the history of the writers or their concerns, and how you navigate that space. What will a publisher allow for you to do in that negotiation is an extraordinary challenge, I think, for some writers. And happily, sometimes you find publishers that will give you that thing. There are people who might not even understand. I've known of Caribbean writers whose words have been constantly edited It's almost as if they get back and erase your poem from what they have sent to a publisher because there is a lack of honesty. They think they're making errors rather than, and that's just a simple level. But that navigation of the publishing world is also important in how can your stories emerge, through the kinds of imagination that you have of them. And of course, we know that we're constantly in conversation with other people in the production of our works, like publishers. So would you say a little bit about that and how fortunate you might have been in that process?
Happy to. But before I do that, I wanted to go back to this idea that you brought up of disturbance. I don't think I answered fully your question before. I didn't want to just repeat what was said in the report, right? I wanted to create worlds within which Black people might survive, being alive. And so, I didn't want to recreate the report. So I think it was intentional for me to just subvert the reader's expectations in that way, right? To kind of flip the report on its head so that we walk away feeling like we've entered various spaces in which things can survive. So the process for me, I don't know if they had a choice. What I wrote was what I wrote. Right. And erasure, I think, is hard enough to edit. So I think with the form itself, they were like, well, we don't even know how to do this. Yeah. So I think partly why I got my way with the look of the book is because they didn't really know what to make of it. Yeah. So much so that initially, I guess this will stay here and on the internet, but my publisher initially did not, he didn't know whether or not he wanted to publish the book. Yeah. Right, and my editor, my publishers are great. I have a really great relationship with them, but they did say that, we'll publish the next book, right? To which I said, I am a writer who wants a home for my work. Where I go is where I stay, and so if you don't take this, you take nothing.
Yeah. Thank you. You wanted to respond to the publishing thing? No, that's fine. Don't get her into trouble. I have many more questions, but I suspect we want some audience participation. So this is my last question from me. One of the things that I really liked about both works is the power, or how you enter into the power of the affective register. Nicole, there's a way that you capture the menace and threat to Black lives in such spare language with provocative, fresh, imagistic flashes. And I read just a bit of that here. Home in the high grass, a barking dog chokes itself against the pull of a tight leash, its neck extending farther than cries for help. A kind of headlight echoing, increasing in reach, the forecast red. And I wondered, if you could, I think also of Canisia in this page. Regret took me from inside and rebuilt my bones, trading blood for fire. There's a way in which both of you are able to engage with the affective register. And I wondered, what is the role of the affective register? Or perhaps I should ask it this way. What is the challenge of representing horror, terror, trauma, or discomfort in your work?
Yeah, this is a good question. Michael A. Bucknor. I didn't know about the criminals, but I was just admiring you handling 3 machines there. So I did feel some horror for you. And so I think someone mentioned to me that there's a kind of cool confidence about the prose, that even when it's carrying some really heavy stuff, it doesn't buckle.
Yes, yes.
I think they said it better than I could, really.
Yeah,
It's really, this is really a quote for quote. But what is the role of that register? I think, I always, I want to feel in my body that I have written something that is true.
Yeah.
That something whose honesty gives me another reason to come back to the page.
Yeah.
I think for a very long time, when I was practicing writing, I think you practice on a lot of false material and this is different than, the anxiety of influence. Well, you're imitating. It's different than that. It's like you are sitting in the materials of your life with an imagination that looks beyond your own door. And then that makes a sound, right? And I think I'm deeply in relation with the sound that living makes, in all of its registers. And so I want to feel a kind of aliveness in what is true, even when it's really uncomfortable, even when it could be horrific. And so the insight that I find is not the first observable insight. It's the second or the third or even the fourth one, right? Because not stopping at the first one where things could be kind of pat, things could be, overly sentimental, things could be, that the sort of obvious cliche would sort of rest in, it rests in melodrama when you're talking about terror,
Yes.
And so I really, the materials of writing for me is always about deep thinking.
Yes.
And the sort of influence on that deep thinking leads me to the kind of musicality of insight, right? So I want to hear the music of the insight.
Yes.
And so if the way that you read that excerpt just now, to me it registered in my body as score, as a kind of, that is the thing that animates me. It animates my awareness and my focus, right? And so I just want the reader, whoever the reader is, to feel as though they've encountered something that is honest and that is true.
And
that's
yet
really
you
it.
are always surprising. I never expect the sentence to go where it goes or the line to go where it goes. And at the same time, it stops me in my tracks. And I have to sit back and say, yes, there is something that has been communicated at the level of the body, and it has been manipulated so carefully and so well done. And, I thank you both for that kind of impact. Would you like to say something to that?
Do we have time?
I think that will be the last statement. 5 minutes to go.
Okay.
So we're going to have to take a few questions. And so
I love what Canisia said. Total agreement. We can move on.
okay. We'd like to open the floor for some questions. The answers were so rich that we spent a lot of time here. Are there any questions? Yes.
Hello. Thank you, Canisia and Nicole, for the work you do. Really vital work that you do. Great. I would clap. My question takes off from a comment that just to both of you, but it draws on a comment you made, Canisia, when you described the code becoming narrative. And you're always so purposeful, you're both so purposeful when you speak and when you write. You didn't say becoming a narrative. You said becoming narrative. A code becoming narrative, perhaps a report becoming narrative. My question, I guess, turns back to the focus of the panel. And I guess it's this. Is your quarrel with history really a quarrel with narrative?
That's a great question. Yeah, yes, absolutely. Because part of what's so corrosive or destructive about our relationship, to history is the way that it has been materialized as a solid object that's behind us. Okay? And as though it's a location that you just point to. You know, that's part of what's so destructive when we think about, you know, how we have been educated in the material reality of that thing. And I think we are a species who live in narrative. It seems to be part of how our sense-making mechanisms operate. Is there's always story, right? There's always causation. This thing led to that, and then the other thing, and this thing happened, right? And what we've been taught about narrative is that it's a kind of linear, you know, there's a line, a neat line that takes us from a point of origin onward, right? And so that quarrel with capital H history, I think, is always a tussle. It's always a tussle with narrative and how that sticky material sort of follows us around, and we internalize it, and we live in its air and its contemporariness. Yeah, it's like we're eating the contemporary narrative. We're breathing it in. We're listening to it, always. But what I find really destructive about it is that the ways in which there is a kind of constant metamorphosis. It moves and it moves in these different shapes, and it takes on these different registers that we don't necessarily recognize as the thing itself being operated. That's what's scary about it, right? So yes, thank you.
I think I am quarreling with history, with the present, and also with these received narratives, right? When I was combing through the report, one instance of anti-Black police violence stuck out. I mean, it all stuck out, but this one in particular, this dude was playing basketball with his boys at a park, after which he sat in his car to kind of just take a breath, right? And a cop comes up to his car and is like accusing him out of nowhere of being a pedophile. He's taking a breath after having playing ball with his boys. And so the man in the car says, I'm not a pedophile. The cop then asks for his name. The guy in the car says, Mike Brown. Cop says, can I have your license? Mike Jones, let's say. Mike Jones gives him his license. And it says Michael. And so then the cop writes him a ticket for giving a false name, right? And so these are the kinds of things that we're contending with. And it reminded me of the past, right? Those kinds of freedom papers one needed to move freely, right? And so the past, as you've said, as we've agreed on, is not ever the past. Time's up. Oh, okay. The past is never quite the past. Yeah.
We're going to ask them to read a minute and to bring this session to a close from their work, to leave those words lingering, resonant with us as we close the session. Whoever is first on it. Can go.
Thank you again for the thoughtful conversation. I'm just going to read a poem by a poet called Mahmoud Darwish, and it's called I Belong There. I belong there. I have many memories. I was born as everyone is born. I have a mother, a house with many windows, brothers, friends, and a prison cell with a chilly window. I have a wave snatched by seagulls, a panorama of my own. I have a saturated meadow. In the deep horizon of my word, I have a moon, a bird's sustenance, and an immortal olive tree. I have lived on the land long before swords turned man into prey. I belong there. When heaven mourns for her mother, I return heaven to her mother, and I cry so that a returning cloud might carry my tears. To break the rules, I have learned all the words needed for a trial by blood. I have learned and dismantled all the words in order to draw from them a single word: home.
Thank you.
And I'll end with a short story from Noir. Earth in the time of Aimé Césaire. On the day we came back from the end of the world, we found a note under your bed. One must begin somewhere. Thank you.
Okay. Nicole Sealey, Canisia Lubrin. They will move to the table to sign books. Those of you who would like to sign books and to have a talk with her, with them. And we're now going to move into another session. The NGC Bocas Lit Fest will continue with another take two. Jared Hossein and Rabindranath Maharaj in conversation with Camille Hernandez Ramdar. Thank you all for coming.